The topic of the presentation today, the Carolingian Renaissance. This is after those dark ages where reading and writing essentially disappears from Western Europe, except for those Irish monks who are keeping reading and writing alive. Hundreds of years go by in Western Europe where there's really nothing much for us to talk about, not in a course like this. An introductory freshman level survey course, there's not an awful lot going on. But hundreds of years go by. Over time, things kind of settle down. The barbarians have burned everything there is worth burning. They've stolen everything worth stealing. And so they settle down and just become farmers. The barbarians are the ancestors of the people we call the Germanic people today. The Germans, Austrians, Swiss, Belgians, Dutch, English, French, and I'm sure I'm leaving some out. Things settle down. Over time, political structures form, communities form alliances with each other to protect each other in case bad guys show up. Eventually the leaders of these communities connect into a network of loyalties. Eventually this network becomes a feudal system. You may have heard that in a world history course sometime. A system of aristocracies and aristocrats who have loyalties to each other. Eventually we see the development of an aristocracy with dukes and duchesses and lords and ladies and princes and princesses, and at the top of the stack the kings and queens. Well, eventually things kind of settle down politically, socially. Educationally, the Irish monks are starting to send out some teams to start monasteries on the continent, but nobody's really paying too much attention to them. And that's really the starting point for what we want to talk about and look at with the Carolingian Renaissance. Finally, we get to something that we can talk about in this course. Hundreds of years have gone by, okay, in the Dark Ages, and now we have something to talk about. The phrase here, the Carolingian Renaissance. First, the word here, Renaissance. That word Renaissance comes from two French words, actually backwards back to two Latin words. The word Renaissance literally means a rebirth. A rebirth of what? Well, it won't ruin the story for you if I tell you. It's a rebirth of reading and writing, a rebirth of literacy. Literacy is going to come back to the continent after hundreds of years of essentially being gone. Now, this word Carolingian. The word Carolingian is a reference to the person who kind of jump-starts this rebirthing process. That's a guy named Charlemagne. Charlemagne is a way of saying in medieval Latin what you and I today in English would call Charles the Great. Charlemagne is just another way of saying Charles the Great. In modern French, the name Carol, the medieval Latin name Charles, the English name Charles, and in fact the Spanish Carlos and the German Karl and so on, they're all the same name, just in different languages. So once you understand how the languages work, you understand that Carolingian, Charlemagne, Charles the Great, that although Carolingian doesn't look like Charlemagne, in fact, when you understand how the languages are working, it's the same name, just in two different languages. Charlemagne, like I said, is going to jumpstart this rebirthing process. I want to say a little bit about Charlemagne. Here over to the side you see a painting, a much later painting of what some artists guessed Charlemagne looked like. I don't think anybody really knows what Charlemagne looked like, but heck, you can look at this. Why not? At the start of the story, Charlemagne is the king of the Franks. You don't have to use too much imagination to figure out who the Franks are today. The Franks, you've already guessed, right? They're the French. Charlemagne's Frankish kingdom is, if we look at a map of modern Europe, is essentially the northern part of where Germany is today, what we call the Low Countries, the Netherlands, Belgium, and Luxembourg, and the northern part of where France is today. Just very roughly this area through here, the Frankish kingdom. Well, Charlemagne comes to the throne. I'm filling in the Frankish kingdom here for you. There we go. Charlemagne comes to the throne as a young man and sets out on a plan of conquest. He wants to conquer as many small nations around him as he can. There we go. You can see my frustration with this sometimes. He picks fights with all the little countries around him. His plan is to make his country, the kingdom of the Franks, as powerful as he can, as large as he can. And it's a pretty good plan. It works pretty well. For the first couple of decades of Charlemagne's reign, it's almost constant warfare. And he's very successful at it. Until the plan hits a snag. So far it's worked pretty well, but then it hits a snag. And that is that Charlemagne has picked fights with all the little countries around him, The only countries left are small countries. And so, he doesn't quite know what to do for the rest of his life. He's had a plan, and now kind of runs out of steam. He doesn't know quite what to do. So he decides to take a trip, a religious trip. He decides to go to Rome, to be in Rome for a particular religious service, a Christmas Mass in the year 800. He wants to, well, first, before we go on, some things about what I've just told you. First of all, Rome. The city of Rome was pretty much abandoned at one point during those dark ages. The barbarians burned it to the ground. Essentially was a ghost town for a while. Eventually some people moved back into the city of Rome, but not very many. Most significantly, the Pope. The Pope is the religious leader, the spiritual leader, the business leader, the CEO of the church in this part of the world. There are other church groups in other parts of the world, but in Western Europe there is one official church with one official Pope during the time period we're talking about now. He makes his headquarters the Vatican. You've probably come across that word before in Rome. But other than the Pope and a few advisors and servants and so on, hardly anybody lives in Rome. It's pretty much a ghost town. But it still had some dignity to it. It still had some status to it. You could walk through the streets of Rome and walk past these huge stone buildings. Of course, the barbarians couldn't burn the stone buildings down. And imagine what Rome looked like, what it was like to live in Rome when, 750,000 people lived there. When, as far as the Romans were concerned now, it was the center of the world from the Romans' perspective. And at the base of a whole empire. And walk through these empty streets and just imagine what this empire must have been like. Christmas Mass is service in more traditional forms of Christianity. It starts late on Christmas Eve and finishes early on Christmas morning. And Christmas Mass is redundant. That's what Christmas means, Christ's Mass. But Christmas, of course, has become much more than just one religious service. And then the year 800. This year here. The last year that I gave you was during the presentation on the fall of Rome. This was in class. That's 476 for the traditional date for the fall of Rome. Actually, Rome is burned to the ground in 476, and that's why that date kind of got stuck as the traditional date of Rome. So hundreds of years have gone by, and there's been nothing really for us to talk about. Just want to underline that point for you. Well, back to the story here. Charlemagne wants to leave his capital, which is up here, and travel down to the city of Rome, to be in Rome for Christmas Mass in the year 800. Charlemagne makes it to Rome in time for this service. He's hoping, you see, I left this part out. He's hoping that if he takes this trip and spends time focusing on the meaning of Christmas in a Christian context, he focuses on prayer and that kind of thing, that maybe God will show up and tell him what to do for the rest of his life, or show him what to do for the rest of his life. Well, it works. I'm not sure that God tells him what to do for the rest of his life, but the Pope does. That's pretty good. Charlemagne makes it to Rome for this service. He goes to the service. The Pope presides at the Eucharist service. But at the end of the service, instead of going in front of the congregation and blessing the people and sending them home, he says, "Charlemagne, King of the Franks, come here." Charlemagne goes up there. The Pope says, "Kneel down." Kneel down on the steps going up to the high altar. Charlemagne kneels down. The Pope goes to a box which had been on the high altar through the whole service. He reaches in the box and he pulls out a crown, and he puts that crown on Charlemagne's head. And then he reaches in that box and he takes out a little bottle of olive oil. I wonder what he's going to do with it. He pours the olive oil on Charlemagne's head, and he says, I wonder what he's going to say, he says, "You are anointed the Holy Roman Emperor." I thought my next slide had that in words for you. That's Holy Roman Emperor. I've got some scenes here of this event happening for you. This is from late medieval painting. You see the Pope anointing Charlemagne here. This is from an illuminated manuscript. I'll say more about that at the end of the presentation today. Rather fanciful scene here. And another example from the illuminated manuscripts. I'll be, again, talking about those at the end of the presentation. Really kind of fanciful scenes here. This is Raphael's take. You might remember the School of Athens we looked at when we talked about Greek philosophers. This is in the same building by the same artist. The Pope announces to the stunned crowd, we're going to rebuild the Roman Empire, the Holy Roman Empire. And from the very beginning, it will be a Christian empire. And the church and the state are going to work together to rebuild the Holy Empire, to rebuild the Roman Empire. And it's going to be called the Holy Roman Empire because from the very beginning, the church and state are going to be united in rebuilding this empire. Well, now, I said, Charlemagne, you are now emperor of all the land that used to be in the Roman Empire. I don't blame you if you suspect that this is some kind of a backroom deal worked out between the Pope and Charlemagne. I don't blame you at all. I mean, we live in a cynical, skeptical age. You and I do. So I don't blame you at all for suspecting that. But I can assure you that that's not the case. Charlemagne is completely surprised by this. He's caught completely off guard by this. And his response to this is the evidence you need to dismiss any suspicions that he had any knowledge this was coming at all. Because his first response is he's absolutely furious with the Pope. It might be hard for 21st century Americans to understand why Charlemagne would be so furious about this. I mean, he's just been proclaimed emperor of all this territory. But you have to understand how courtly behavior worked. You have to understand manners and customs and all the behaviors that go along with the royal court. Picture in your mind now. The Pope tells Charlemagne to kneel down. The Pope takes the crown and puts it on Charlemagne's head. Now, who's really in charge? The Pope, right? You see, the Pope has really played Charlemagne. Now he's given Charlemagne the political job, but he's also publicly demonstrated that he's the one who's really calling the shots. He's really played Charlemagne here, you see. And when Charlemagne finally gets away from the crowd and the church and the Pope and all this stuff going on, and he gets with his advisors, he's absolutely furious at what the Pope has done to him. He says to his advisors, if I'd wanted that crown, I would put it on my own head. You get it? He's really upset about it. He's really angered by what the Pope has done to him. His next response, and once he settles down a little bit, his next response is the rest of the evidence you need. He says the plan won't work. It's a crazy plan. And in fact, Charlemagne is right and the Pope is wrong. This is a crazy plan. It's not going to work. The Pope has left out some little small details here. He's forgotten about some things. I hope you haven't forgotten. There's a whole nother empire over here. The Byzantine Empire, with its emperor in Byzantium. I guess the Pope's plan is for Charlemagne to get on a boat and sail to Byzantium and go up to the palace of the Byzantine emperor and say, the Pope says, I'm the boss of you now. And the Byzantine emperor is going to say, well, okay, I guess I'll go live in the streets. I mean, this isn't going to work. Something else really big, all right, that we spend an awful lot of time talking about in the world history course. Don't spend so much time in this course talking about. That is over here. Over here in the Arabian desert, something really big is happening, and that is the birth of Islam. Islam comes bursting out of the Arabian desert as a political force, a military force, a religious force, in all kinds of different directions. For us, most significantly, it spreads across Roman Africa, North Africa, up into Europe, through where Spain and Portugal is today, all the way to the border with France. All of this down here is part of the Muslim Empire. Like the Caliph of Spain even cares who the Pope is, let alone what the Pope says about Charlemagne. So this won't work. It won't work. But on the other hand now, Charlemagne is, well, he's a stand-up guy, all right? He's been given this job to rebuild the empire. He's looking for something to do. So he at least begins thinking about what it would take to rebuild this empire. And this gives him a further spur to do something which he'd already begun making moves towards in the first place. And that is, he thinks to himself, you know, I have enough trouble running my own small kingdom. How would we run this huge empire if no one around here knows how to read and write? And so he sends off to these Irish monks over here who've been keeping reading and writing alive all these years. And he says, now we need this gift you have. Now's your time. Now we need this gift. And these Irish monks, a team of them, leave and come back to the continent, bringing reading and writing in a big way back to Western Europe. They're led by a man who is... There we go. They're led by a man who is not exactly a famous person at all. A very important person, but not a very famous person at all. Certainly not a big household name. I would be... make sure you understand what I'm saying here. I'd be surprised if any of you have ever heard of Alcuin before, and I don't say that as a put-down or to be patronizing. I say that seriously because I really would be surprised. He's not a very famous person at all, not a very big name at all, but he is a very important person. Alcuin is the leader of these Irish monks who makes his way back to the continent, bringing reading and writing back to the continent. Alcuin is given the job of creating a school at Charlemagne's palace, which he calls, rather uncreatively, the Palace School. Charlemagne's palace is in Charlemagne's capital city, the city of Aachen, Aix-la-Chapelle, two different names for the same city. Just like we talked about, Byzantium had three different names in its history. The city of Aachen has had two different names. When the Germans have control of it, they call it the city of Aachen. When the French have control of it, they call it Aix-la-Chapelle. Alcuin starts a palace school. I've got some other images of Alcuin here. This is from an illuminated manuscript, and again we'll say more about those at the end of the presentation. Alcuin the scholar with two of his students here. Here we have Alcuin over here showing Charlemagne a book over here. I'll leave that up there so you have something to look at besides me while I talk about a little bit about Alcuin and the palace school. Charlemagne makes a rule, makes a law, that from now on if you want a big government job, if you want anything other than an entry-level job, if you want anything higher, say in the military, other than entry-level foot soldier, if you want any kind of high-paying government job, then you have to know how to read and write. And so pretty soon there's a line forming outside of Charlemagne's palace school so that people can learn how to read and write and get those high-paying government jobs. Well, some of them are going to burn out on those high-paying jobs, maybe wash out too. And some will retire and still have a lot of energy and want to do something with the rest of their life. They'll start their own schools and charge lower tuition, undercut the tuition at the palace school, set up some competition. Eventually, some of those schools will become so large that one faculty member can't teach all the students, and so he'll hire colleagues to teach with him. That's the origin of the word college. That word college originally meant a school where you had more than one teacher. In some large cities, you might have 5, 6, 7 colleges who would get together and make an agreement with each other to share library space and dormitory space and cafeterias and that kind of thing. That's the origin of the university. That's the difference between a college and a university. A college is a college. A university has several colleges in it. If you go up to the University of Florida, for example, and look around, there's there's the Warrington College of Business and the Levin College of Law and the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences. There's all these different colleges. And Warrington College and Levin College, they all have different admissions requirements and all those kinds of things, but they share the cafeterias and the dormitories and the parking lots and the libraries and the football team and all that kind of stuff. Well, these schools, there's a progress, you see, from Alcuin School to the university system, and I'm sure you're well aware, we've been making some changes around here at CF lately even, that the state colleges, what used to be called the community colleges, are now pretty much becoming the first 2 years of the state university system. And so there's a straight line, you see, from Alcuin's Palace School here to the College of Central Florida. If you think back to that list of philosophers that we talked about whenever we did, Alexander the Great studied with Aristotle, Aristotle studied with Plato, Plato studied with Socrates. All the teachers you've had, at least if you've grown up within Western culture, all the teachers you've had studied with somebody who studied with somebody who studied with somebody who learned how to read from Alcuin. There's you're in Alcuin's family tree, and academically, And that there's that connection back to Alcuin that there isn't, say, to Plato's Academy. Plato's Academy died out and was destroyed. But there's Alcuin's the origin of the Western educational tradition. And you see that in one of the first things that Alcuin does, what anybody has to do when they start a school, and that is to come up with a curriculum. This word curriculum should be familiar to you as college students. The curriculum is the list of courses that you take to get whatever degree program you're registered in, whatever program you're registered in. You know how it works. You've all done this, right? You decided to go to college. That's kind of a big deal for a lot of people. You decided to go to college. Then you applied. You were accepted. Then you enroll, and then you start registering in classes and taking classes. And eventually you figure out what you want to major in. Some people show up knowing right off the bat what they want to do, or what they want to walk away from their first 2 years of college with. Other people, well, it takes them some time, experimentation, and trying to figure out, what's exactly a good fit for them. But eventually you figure out what degree you want and what your major should be, and then you get the curriculum. And you check off the courses you've already taken. As you take more courses, you check off more courses. And then eventually, you stick with it. You check off the last course, and there you go. You finish this part of your educational journey. It's kind of a big deal. You graduate. Well, Alcuin sets up his curriculum as a 4-year program. That might ring a bell with you. We tend to think of education in 4-year groups. Okay, high school, 4 years, 4 years for the bachelor's degree, and so on. The first part of Alcuin's curriculum is a 2-year program called the Trivium. It'll come as no surprise to you that there's 3 parts to the Trivium: grammar, rhetoric, and logic. Grammar means putting words together so that you can communicate clearly. Rhetoric means putting words together so that they sound pretty, so that someone who starts reading what you've written wants to continue reading what you've written. In other words, having a good writing style, something that invites the reader to have access to your ideas. And logic. Logic means putting words together to communicate truth, to communicate rational truth. The first 2 years of Alcuin's curriculum are essentially 2 years of English comp classes, and I know that's an awful lot, but you see what Alcuin is doing. He's taking people who don't even know what the alphabet is. Even more than that, they don't even know how an alphabet would work, if they did know what the alphabet was. And in 2 years producing what you and I would call college-level writers. So it's a pretty intensive, a pretty impressive program. Once you finish the Trivium, once you've mastered the trivial things, that's where the word trivial comes from, once you've learned the little stuff like reading and writing, then you move on to the Quadrivium. It won't shock you to learn that there are 4 parts to the Quadrivium: arithmetic, geometry, astronomy, and music. Arithmetic, you know what arithmetic is. Addition, subtraction, multiplication, and division. Geometry, that's the highest form of mathematics that Alcuin had access to. He doesn't know about algebra yet. Trigonometry hasn't even been invented yet. Calculus certainly hasn't been invented yet. The highest form of mathematics that Alcuin has access to. Astronomy in scare quotes there, because astronomy here is not quite what you might think of as astronomy today. About half of what Alcuin called astronomy you and I would recognize as practical astronomy: how to navigate by the stars, how to tell time by the sun, how to measure longitude on a map by the sun, how to the phases of the moon, how to make a calendar, all those kinds of things. The other half of what Alcuin called astronomy you and I would recognize as astrology. What does it mean when certain planets are in certain constellations? What does that imply about events going on Earth? Today we recognize those things as very different things, okay? One thing being a science, the other being more superstition. But for Alcuin, it's all the same thing, okay? It's just star stuff, all right? And that division between astronomy and astrology is more recent than you might suspect. Music. This is going to push you a little bit. Music isn't at all what you might expect. It has nothing to do with learning to play the piano or learning to sing in a choir or anything like that. Music is a way to multiply and divide fractions, believe it or not. It's a mathematical tool. Yeah, it's a way to multiply and divide fractions. Here's how music would work. Your first day of class, you make your musical instrument. You take let's say a 2x4. It's about 4 foot long, let's say. You put a nail in one end, you put a nail in the other end. You take a copper wire, you tie it real tight to one end, and then you tie it real tight to the other end, and you got a crank down here to tune your musical instrument. Well, you get that tuned. When you pluck that wire, you get a sound. You get a note. Everyone understands how that works. It's how a guitar works, right? You get a note. Well, if you have that wire, say that wire is 4 foot long, and you find the halfway point, and you hold the wire at that halfway point, and you pluck the wire so that you, is the microphone in the way? You pluck that wire so that you're only plucking half the length of the wire. The wire isn't vibrating past where your finger is. Then you get a note that is 1 octave higher than the first note. That's where notes come from in Western culture. They're the fractions of the length of vibrating wire. The person who developed the first mathematical musical system of notation was Pythagoras. You remember Pythagoras from the pre-Socratic philosophers, his interest in music. I'm sorry, his interest in numbers. It shows up in his interest in music as well. That's why in Western culture, when you listen to music being played and everything is tuned, the instruments are tuned correctly. If it's in tune, then you're actually listening to mathematics. You're listening to fractions bouncing off of each other. That's why, in fact, you may know someone who's really, really good at music, not just someone who has a natural singing voice. I don't. Or can play the piano. I can't. Or something like that, but who really understands how music works. Someone like that, if you know someone like that, they probably are very good at mathematics too. Not always, but usually. Because it's really the same type of intelligence to work with mathematics as it takes to work with music at a pretty sophisticated level. At any rate, now you got your musical instrument, now you can multiply and divide fractions. You see, let's take an easy one. You know, what's 1/2 times 1/2? Well, you measure out your wire, you find the halfway point, 1/2 times 1/2, measure half of 1/2, you pluck the wire, and you have memorized all the different notes you can play on your musical instrument, and you say that's the note for 1/4. Now you're tempted to just grab a piece of paper and do it, because it's not all that difficult. But that's because at some point you've come into contact with algebra. And the way I understand it is that if you understand how algebra works, then multiplying and dividing fractions is really no big deal. But if all you have is arithmetic and geometry, then it actually is easier just to memorize all the little notes you can play on your musical instrument and then just play them and play out the answer on the musical instrument. Well, if you look at Alcuin's curriculum, you see that there are remnants of it, and in fact the foundation of the general education core here at CF, Gen Ed core, it's called around here. You get a little bit of grammar in the English comp classes. You get rhetoric in the English comp classes. And your professors help you off and on in different courses for the rest of your college career, developing and improving your writing style. By the way, that's probably one of the most important things you can do for yourself while you're in college is to focus on your writing style and rhetoric, okay? A lot of people have good ideas, and they have a very difficult time communicating those ideas. And if you have a great idea for something, you send a memo to your boss, and your boss gets 3 or 4 sentences in and just says, I'm not going to read this stuff. You undercut yourself. So just a word of advice there. You know, you got people here around here who will help you and who want to help you improve your writing style. You know, that's one of the best things you can do for yourself around here. Anyway, you get rhetoric in the English comp. You get a little bit of logic in the English comp courses. You get some logic in the math courses. We actually offer a course in logic here at CF. It's taught by Professor Olson in this division. He has a course where we spend an entire semester just thinking about clearly thinking your way through problems, learning how to tell the truth from falsehood. You can read a sentence that looks like it's perfectly true, and then you look very carefully at the sentence, and you realize, wait a second, it's not. It's not true at all. We have those opportunities here. Those are built into the Gen Ed core. Everybody has that basic math requirement. What are those courses? Basic math for liberal arts majors, basic math for business majors, and health sciences, and so on. Everyone has a higher mathematics requirement, usually college algebra. Some programs have different math requirements. Everyone has that science requirement. What is that, 6 hours, I think? No, 8? However many hours it is. Everyone has that science requirement. And then, no, you don't really learn how to multiply and divide by playing your musical instrument. But you do learn the technology of the day, which fairly clearly for 21st century America is the Internet. You show up at CF, and of course you probably know, though you might not, but you probably do, know how to Google for stuff and all that kind of stuff and go shopping on eBay and all that kind of thing. But at some point you have teachers who sit you down and teach you how to find reliable sources of information, how to evaluate websites for the quality of the information you get off of them and so on. And you probably already had some of those discussions. So you see, anyway, there's a straight line from Alcuin's curriculum to our curriculum here at CF. So a very important figure. Here is a later celebration of Charlemagne and Alcuin here in a stained glass window. Your clue that it's later than what we're talking about is it's a stained glass window. You'll catch that in the next presentation, actually. Alcuin the scholar over here, Charlemagne the politician over here, uniting to bring this Carolingian Renaissance, the recovery of reading and writing. Really, it's a big part. Really, it's a big part of the story. It's a big deal for Western culture. One minor thing to associate with Alcuin is that he's also responsible for standardizing the liturgy. We talked about this concept of the liturgy when we talked about early Christianity. You remember the liturgy is developed so that Christians living in different parts of the empire, on a certain Sunday as they gathered with other Christians to worship, they would all be worshiping together because they'd all be singing the same songs, hearing sermons based on the same scripture readings and so on. Well, that worked okay when people could read and write, all right? But once reading and writing disappears from this part of the world, once reading and writing disappears from this part of the world, Christians in different parts of what had been the empire come up with their own liturgies. These are usually short, very clunky kind of liturgies because they had to be memorized, all right? So that's 52 services that had to be memorized. So they're usually kind of short and clunky and not very sophisticated. Well, the Pope figures out that since we got reading and writing back, let's get this idea of a standardized liturgy back. And Alcuin's given the job of coming up with a standard liturgy. The liturgy that Alcuin develops is what's called a sung service, S-U-N-G, sung service, where everything in the service is set to music. The scripture readings, the prayers, everything's that's set to music, and set to a particular type of music. A type of music called Gregorian chant.